So before understanding what is API, let me start with some basic terms. Terms like what is service. If you're looking at this diagram, you have right hand side you have a server, left hand side you have a client. So server generally hosts a service. A service is nothing but a function or a method that can be reused. So a server could host a service like add service, weather service, a validate XML service, and this service is basically a piece of code that has been written in Java or .NET and exposed in the server, right? And now client A or B, maybe your computer or maybe a laptop or maybe a mobile device, can make use of this service. They don't have to write everything, they just have to call the service and the service will execute the business logic and return the output from the service. So it's basically a reusable concept. If there's a service available in any of the server, you can just go and use it. So that's a term called service. It's just nothing but a function or a method that can be reused, and it's mostly available in a server. And next is, what is a web service? Well, web service is very simple to understand. A service that is accessed over a web is a web service. So any server that is hosting a service which is accessible in the internet, and then you can use some of the protocol to access that service, then basically that is a web service. Again, similarly, the service could be anything as per what the business logic has been defined in that service. But most important, the term web service is used when a service is accessible over the internet. Okay, so that's another term for you. And in terms of a web service, there's always this request and a response. So first, whenever the service is available in the server, it actually is just sitting there and waiting for a request. So every client that want to use the service, they raise a request. And as I told you, the web service use a protocol called SOAP protocol. Client will initiate a request to an server for that service by using the SOAP request, right? And then the data will be stored in an XML and that is passed over to the server. And once server receive that request from a client stating that okay, now the client want to use this service, the given data or basically an input parameter to that service will be passed over, and server execute that logic in the server and returns an output of that service. And then that output is basically sent back to the client, and then the client will receive that response and then hence close the connection. So this basically, in a web service, always understand there's a request and a response. The client initiates the request based on the XML, passing the data whatever required to call the service. Then server will respond back with the output of the servers in the same XML format to the client. Well, there's another word called interface. So let me explain to you what's the difference between the service and an interface. So if you're looking at this example, let's say we have our iPhone, and iPhone has various interfaces, right? It has this feature of clock. You can access browser, you can access the mic to record, you can do start and stop, then you have a calendar function. Some of the interfaces are basically attached back to an hardware device, let's say clock or a mic. A mic is a good example, right? Mic has an interface between the hardware to the phone, and then if you want to build an app which uses the mic feature, the mic will expose an interface for you. An interface basically the way you communicate to that mic, and using that interface you communicate to the mic, and your app will capture all the details, and then in the background it uses this interface to to record or to get the data from the mic hardware device. So imagine service is basically a function or a method. Web service is a piece of software, a piece of service written in an internet. Interface basically is a way to access something. If there is a mic hardware sitting in your phone, or basically a start and stop button in the iPhone, the interface will provide you a method to use that hardware device. The phone already predefined with set of interfaces for you to access each of this application. Let's say you want to change the time, you don't directly go and change the hardware settings, right? You don't have that low level API access. You directly go ahead and access the clock via the clock interface exposed by the phone. So that's how an interface will work when it's different from the service, because interface will give you an access to that specific device or an application or basically an hardware. So let us now define what is an API. If you're hearing API for the first time and trying to understand it, then basically API is a concept, okay, not a function library, not a programming language, or not a protocol, right? It's just a concept. So go from it. API is the way you do interfacing, okay? That's basically a concept. So here's the full form of an API. API stands for Application Programming Interface. There are three words in it that's really help you understand what is API. First is the application, second is the programming, third is the interface. We learn what is interface. Application is nothing but the component or the apps, right? Like mic is an application, right? And then programming means anyone who want to access that application via that interface, then it needs to use a program to access it. Okay, so let me repeat. An application exposes an interface, right? And then a programmer or developer will access that functionality of the device or an application via that interface. Okay, so let me elaborate with an example. Imagine right hand side is your application or server. Then you have all these APIs, or basically I will not use API, I'll say interface. Okay, like get system health API to access the system health, then get RAM status, get disk status, get date time status. So all these interfaces that's available for the application. So no one directly go and figure out what is the disk status of an application. If they want to know the health, they want to know the system health, they use this interface to understand what is this application is doing. So there is a set of interface defined, and once that interface is defined, you have no access to the application. And then that's basically the definition of an API. You expose your application with some set of APIs, with set of interfaces to say, in order to talk to me, right, you have only available interface. You have only this set of interfaces available to talk to me. It's like, setting up a standard ahead saying, if you want to talk to me, then you have these options available to talk to me. Apart from that, we're not going to do or communicate with each other anything else. And then no one have access directly to the application. That's the benefit of the interface. It provides a layer on top of the application stating what it can access and how it's been going to respond when a request is made to these APIs. The program in the API stands for the program that is used to call these interfaces. Okay, so let me do a proper definition of an API. API defines what functionalities are available, how it can be used, and what format it will accept as input or return as an output. Okay, that's basically a very proper definition of an API. And if you don't understand what is it, it's very simple to view from the three words that I've just explained: application, interface, and the program. Application exposes interfaces to say, if you want to communicate with me, these are all the interfaces available to communicate with me, right? And each interface has a request and response. Like the service that we have seen, even interface have a request and a response. And then you want to talk to me, you talk to me via a program. So I will expose my interface in terms of an standard programming language, standard programming methods. Like, you have to send a JSON data to me, then I'll respond to a JSON data, something like that. But in terms of a standard point of view, my interfaces will be exposed as an programming standard. So any program can typically come and call that interface. Think API like companies exposing it for every programmer to use. I'll give you a very simple definition. Let's say all your files are available in a Dropbox, and then you want to access Dropbox. Dropbox in the background is a server. It's a big data center sitting somewhere in a location. He don't give you access to that server like a file system, right? You cannot just go to a Dropbox using an FileZilla, open a port FTP, and then download all the files. They expose an interface. They say, to access your files, these are the interfaces available. The interfaces is a generic term, as again I tell you. It could be a mobile app, it could be a web application, it could be an API, right? API generally means you need to talk to an API via a program. Interface is different, right? A mobile phone, a human can talk to that API, to that interface. An interface of web, a human can talk, but an API, only a program can talk to an API. So they expose their API via some programming language, via some programming standard, and then they use JSON or XML as a data standard to exchange the messages. So Dropbox has an API. I'm going to show you that in the later sessions. Dropbox has an API where you can connect with any programming language, and then you can request to download a file, request to create a folder. You can do all sorts of operation. It's again limited because Dropbox only provide a set of APIs for you to access your files. It does not provide direct access to your application. That's why API is basically an interfacing, and as P in API, that's a program, so it allow only a program to access that API. Even Google Map API expose functionality to access the map with limited APIs and defined format with input and output parameter. Even think of a printer. Today, those printers that we see, the big HP printers, or IBM based printers, Canon printers, they have an API attached to it. Means if you want to print from a program, you can use that API from a program to send the data to the printer, and the printer will print it. Even iPhone has an API. Even your iWatch have an API. Yeah, right. So API could be an interface via which we can access the application. It is defined and allowed limited access with some rules. That's basically the API.